Look, thank you very, very much for having me at your Food for Thought Festival. And let's go a little bit higher, turn it around, and then we look at, okay, let's think about food, but perhaps even go further, let's look at intelligent food systems and how do we actually use food and really sort of use food as a vehicle into the future for our health and future. It's pretty fundamental, and John's already introduced it, and of course Amanda has as well. There are now 7.4 billion people on the planet. Up to 10 billion are projected by mid-century, UN figures, and basically they all have one thing in common: every day they want to eat. Okay? They want to eat. No problems. And if they're not eating, then obviously, as we said earlier, 7 missed meals between social stability and crisis. And this is getting serious now, because 70% of those 10 billion within a matter of decades will be living in urban concentrations. And of course then the question is, how do they get food? Amanda's already raised it. The issue is affordability of food, not just can we produce weight or volume of food, but is it affordable? And so the question is, yes, how do we make sure we have equity in food? So it's more than just producing food, it's giving people equity so they maintain social stability. And Amanda again showed these beautiful figures. You see what's going to happen and how much food's going to go to biofuels and how much food's going to go to animals. And we really want to go back to the other more basics and come to the realization that 80% of the food that goes into human mouths as digestion, not counting the biofuels, not counting the waste, not counting the animals, 80% of the food that goes into humans to feed humans is grown by small farmers, is grown in gardens, is grown by women. Okay, so it is the women, farmers, gardening in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. Really that's what feeds people. And so that's what, in a sense, is critical if we're going to meet that food quantity future, that equity future. In 2008, we had the Arab Spring and we had all those crises, but basically in 2008 we were producing enough food to feed 12 billion people. It just didn't get to the people, it just wasn't affordable. So the issue is much, much bigger. It's a social issue, but it's also empowering those small farmers, those gardeners, those women to grow healthy, nutritious food. As I mentioned before, we've got this other fundamental issue. It's not the quantity of food we produce, it's the quality of the food we produce. It's the nutritional integrity of that food. They gave Linus Pauling 4 Nobel Prizes in the 50s, and the conclusion he came up with and showed in biochemistry absolutely that 90% of our preventative health is directly related to the nutritional integrity of the food we eat. Okay, so the issue is the quality of our food. What have we done to the quality of our food? And of course we're seeing the consequences. In answer to Justin's question, we're seeing the consequences because, as I mentioned, we've got this exponential increase in all these self-induced diet-related diseases. The 19th century was all about fighting external agents of disease, the sort of malaria, the cholera and what have you. We've still got some of those, of course. But now the 21st century is all about us killing ourselves through the food we eat. Although we shouldn't call it food, through the stuff we eat. And of course we have about a $4 trillion a year global agricultural industry. We have a $10 trillion a year global food processing industry. And we have about a $40 trillion a year disease industry feeding off the other two. And that's, again, the reality that Charles sort of, in a sense, framed that we have to start thinking about. Okay, so let's get off the problems, because we're not here to talk about the problems, but it's the context of what we're trying to do. How do we empower ourselves to change it? But let's start talking about what are the solutions. How do we change it? What can we do? And to do that, really, we go back to basics, right? Really say, well, look, what is the basis of our food? In a sense, it's very simple, isn't it? It's sunshine, it's CO2, it's water, because that's where we fix carbon, that's where all the sugars, that's where all the energy comes from. But of course, that can't happen unless those plants that we're growing have nutrients, essential nutrients. And those essential nutrients can only come from the soil. So it's all about the business of, well, how do these plants get these nutrients, and not just get nutrients randomly, but get nutrients in the right forms, concentrations, ratios, and balances that they need for their health. And quite frankly, we're just sort of omnivores that have tagged on at the end because their health is our health. So healthy people need healthy food from healthy plants, from healthy soils. It's one system. Okay, so what made this whole thing work, and how does it all go? Back to basic, and I suppose we go back, when some of us were younger, 4.6 billion years ago, there was a supernova that created a new cloud of hydrogen gas that formed our current sun and left behind a whole lot of stardust. Stardust, which was made up of 96 natural elements, which are, of course, described in our periodic table, that all our chemist friends sort of, get excited about. So they should. And basically that stardust coalesced to form then the solar system, the 9 planets, including Earth. Okay, but the really marvelous thing that happened, and really why we're here, happened 3.8 billion years ago. And if I may use the whiteboard, because again, I'm old, not that old, but and 3.8 billion years ago, something very, very special happened. We basically had an oil film, lipid film, and basically in that sort of little cell, or that little microscopic oil film, this membrane, this protomembrane started to say, look, I can concentrate essential nutrients. So I might have 20 parts per million of phosphorus out here, but I can concentrate 200 parts per million of phosphorus in there. So the selective uptake and concentration of nutrients enabled a completely different chemical composition inside this little cell compared to outside in the primordial soup. But this membrane was able to do something else. That was able to exclude a whole lot of toxic nutrients, because a lot of this world outside is pretty toxic. And because the membrane had this selective, intelligent uptake capability, and it developed that, so whether there might have been 200 parts per million of, just say, aluminium out here, basically only 20 parts per million was aluminium, got inside. So really the powerful thing that happened 3.8 billion years ago was that first cell evolving with the capacity to concentrate and exclude different elements. But by concentrating different elements, it did something else. It created an electrical potential across that membrane. So if you've got 20 charges out there and 200 there, you've got a massive charge difference. And the electrical potential is, in a sense, a charge difference over the distance. The membrane distance is, of course, microscopic or beyond microscopic. It's just angstroms. It's, billionths of a meter. And so you had enormous electrical potential or charge across that membrane. And of course, that's the energetics that drives life. And so really what happened 3.8 billion years, life evolved through this very simple process. And through concentrating and excluding and having this energetics, life then created biochemistry. And all of us just function on biochemistry, and that whole life process of biochemistry is driven by these membranes. We break those membranes, these nutrients go back to the primordial soup, of course we're dead. Okay, that's that simple. And this only had to have happened once, because then as this grew, it budded off and produced all of life on this planet. Okay? So this is really the foundation of life. But the message I want to give, it is the nutritional integrity of that concentration and exclusion of nutrient and the energetics that it creates that in a sense has governed all of life, has governed all of our health. Okay, so that's the starting point. But we move on, so we can take this away. And now we get back to agriculture. Because really, ever since 3.8 billion years ago till the Second World War, our food and our biosystem functioned exactly on that process, on the concentration, exclusion, and the nutritional integrity of the plants that it produced, and therefore the food we produced. And of course, up to the Second World War, we didn't have to worry about the nutritional integrity and health of our food because nature was doing that for us through that process. But after the Second World War, things changed fundamentally, and Charles, in a sense, has raised that a little bit. So let me draw that for you. Okay, we've drawn a little plant here, and this is pre-Second World War. Okay. And this is post-World War II. And in a sense, how plants grew, and 99% of plants all through history grew. Obviously there's photosynthesis, there's roots, but basically these roots had these mycorrhizal fungal relationships, symbioses, and massive lengths of fungal hyphae then grew from the sort of roots of these plants and extended across the soil surfaces. Okay, 25,000 kilometers of fungal hyphae per cubic meter of healthy soil. Okay, you multiply that by pi times the diameter of these things and you can work out the surface area of that intelligent soil microbial root interface. And that interface on every part of its molecular surface was concentrating and excluding and selectively taking up the nutrients it needs and we need for our health. So basically, life and health, everything depended on these fundamental soil interfaces, these soil microbial root interfaces, these symbioses. And everybody was apples, right? Everything worked perfectly. But then, after the Second World War, we did something different. Because as Charles has already sort of said, we had a lot of industrial capacity. So we had a massive capacity to clear, to burn, to cultivate, to fertilize, to use biocides, to irrigate, to fallow land. And we've done that enormously. There's 13.9 billion hectares of land on this planet. They're not making any more of it. Some of it's going underwater with sea level rise. Okay? And out of that, we've created 5 billion hectares of man-made desert and wasteland so far. John was just saying how much that 5 minutes ago. Oh, go, water. So basically, John was telling us how much even China is eroding or degrading at the moment, 600,000 hectares a year. Okay, so basically, Second World War, we did a lot of destruction, but we've also basically totally killed this microbial interface. Because as Charles has just sort of said, that basically these toxins, these biocides, obviously are completely incompatible. So now basically our plants are on a completely different basis of nutrient uptake. Instead of taking nutrients up through these interfaces, they basically are just taking nutrients up from the soil solution, basically as a straw. Okay, so it's really just the nutrients that are in the soil solution are getting sucked up by the plants as part of their transpiration stream. And so these plants now are getting a lot of soluble nutrients, all the nutrients we put on in fertilizer, the nitrogen, potassium, sulfur, phosphorus, but often very, very low levels or none of the essential nutrients, the trace elements, the 50 plus essential nutrients we need for our nutrient integrity and health. The food that we eat now has less than a third of the nutrient density and integrity pre-World War II. Okay, and this is fundamental. For example, selenium. We only need selenium in parts per million. But if we don't have selenium, we can't make perioxidized enzymes. And we say, well, bugger that, who cares? Well, people do care, because only those perioxidized enzymes can kill cancer cells. So that's a fundamental part of our self-regulation, cancer immune, cancer defense mechanism. Okay, and by compromising that through compromising the nutritional integrity of our food and how we grow our plants, we have fundamentally changed the whole disease epidemics. And as I mentioned before, here we are, whether it's obesity, diabetes, cancer, cardiac, autoimmune, allergies, the list goes on. All self-induced explosive diseases in the last 50 years post-World War II. It's an association. Obviously, it's a very complicated game, this biochemistry, so there's not absolute, smoking gun proof, but the association, whether it's CSIRO, Human Nutrition, UK Ministry of Agriculture, 2 minutes ago, it's very, very clear. Thank you very much for the 2 minutes. Okay, so what have we done to our food? I think we've made that point very clear. But that's how we grow our food, but now it's gone even further. Because basically, just as we have an interface in the soil, we also have exactly the same copy of interface in our intestines. See, inside our gut, the food we eat is just like in the soil. We just have all this mixture of food that we can take in. But what gets into our bloodstream is governed by our intestines. It's governed by a membrane interface in the villi, those little sacs in our absorptive small intestine and large intestine that are absorbing those nutrients. And again, if we destroy and impair those membranes, we can't control what gets in from what we put into our mouths, our food, and what goes into our blood. And of course, if we have, and this is again what Charles read, if we use genetic engineering, we're putting completely novel substances into our gut. And our bacteria in the gut are breaking those down into completely novel byproducts. And of course, 1 minute to go. And those, no minutes to go. Okay, very quickly. And okay, so that basically, we are basically now destroying or have destroyed that interface, that membrane interface in our gut. And of course, that is a big consequence of why we're getting this disease outbreak. Okay, so the point is, just concluding, yes, here is what has happened to our soils. The answer is we can change all this. We can go back and grow food naturally. This is what we've done to our health. We've changed all that gut microbiome and how that microbiome absorbs and uses nutrients. We can change all that. We can control all those diseases, but it involves change. We'll talk about that later. Thank you very much.